Everyone knew the truth about my father. My relatives knew, family friends knew, even my mother knew. I was the only one who didn't. When I was a child, my father seemed like the most stable person in the world. He was always on time. His voice never rose, even when the house was loud. Everything in our home followed a strict rhythm: dinner at the same hour, weekends planned in advance, conversations that stayed safe and shallow. I believed this was what reliability looked like. I grew up inside that order and never questioned it. If something felt strange, the adults would smile and tell me I was too young to understand. I accepted that explanation easily. It was comforting to believe that the people around me knew more than I did. My father rarely spoke about emotions, but his calm presence felt reassuring. He didn't explain things. He simply existed, solid and unquestioned. There were no dramatic scenes, no visible arguments, just repetition. The same routines, the same silence, the same sense that nothing ever truly changed. I learned early that quiet was normal, that asking questions disrupted harmony, and that trust meant not looking too closely. At least, that was how trust was taught to me. There was a woman who had always been part of our lives. I never questioned her place there. She appeared at birthdays, school events, quiet family dinners. She knew my favorite foods, remembered stories from my childhood, spoke to my parents as if she belonged. I had known her since I was young enough not to doubt adults. She and my father moved around each other with an ease that felt practiced. Nothing inappropriate, nothing obvious. Just small gestures that didn't stand out unless you paid attention for too long. A shared glance, a pause in conversation, a familiarity that felt deeper than friendship, but not loud enough to be named. Everyone treated her presence as natural. My mother never reacted. My relatives spoke to her warmly. I learned, without realizing it, that this woman was part of the structure of our family, like furniture that had always been there. At the time, I thought this meant trust. I thought it meant maturity. I didn't understand that silence can be an agreement, or that some truths are hidden not because they are dangerous, but because everyone has decided they are easier to live with unspoken. As I grew older, small inconsistencies began to surface. They didn't arrive as revelations, only as moments that felt slightly out of place. My father would leave the room to take phone calls and return quieter than before. Plans would change without explanation. Some evenings carried a tension that no one acknowledged. I noticed how conversations stopped when I entered the room, how looks were exchanged quickly, then dismissed. No one ever told me to leave, but I learned when I wasn't supposed to listen. It wasn't hostility, it was coordination. Everyone seemed to know the rules except me. That woman remained present, unchanged. She still laughed with my parents, still spoke about the past as if she had lived it with us. Sometimes I caught myself watching her more closely, trying to understand why her presence felt heavier than before. Whenever I sensed something was wrong, I dismissed it. I told myself I was imagining patterns where none existed. After all, nothing was openly broken. There were no arguments, no confessions, no scenes. Just a growing awareness that clarity was being carefully avoided, and I was learning, slowly, how to look away with everyone else. Over time, the strange moments stopped feeling strange. They became part of the background, like a low noise you no longer notice. The pauses, the unfinished sentences, the careful choice of words, all of it blended into everyday life. No one explained anything, but no one acted confused either. That was the most unsettling part. I learned what not to ask. I learned which topics were safe and which ones caused a sudden shift in the room. Adults didn't tell me lies directly. They didn't need to. Their silence did the work for them. It created a version of reality that functioned smoothly, as long as I didn't press too hard. My father remained calm, consistent, unchanged. The woman remained present, familiar, accepted. My mother remained quiet. Everything stayed in place, and that stability was used as proof that nothing was wrong. Looking back, I understand how carefully this world was maintained, not through deception, but through agreement. Everyone had decided what could exist openly and what had to stay unnamed. And without realizing it, I was being trained to participate in that agreement. I didn't find out through an argument or a confession. No one sat me down. No one thought I deserved an explanation. The truth reached me quietly, the way everything else in our family did, through a sentence said too casually, through a look that lingered too long, through the sudden understanding of something that had always been there. It happened on an ordinary day. Nothing about it felt important at first. But once I understood, the meaning rearranged everything that came before it. The pauses, the glances, the woman's permanent place in our lives, my father's calm, my mother's silence. None of it was accidental. What struck me most was not the betrayal itself. It was how old the truth was. This wasn't a recent mistake. It wasn't a secret that slipped out. It had existed alongside my childhood, quietly, patiently, while I grew up believing in a version of my family that wasn't real. There was no urge to scream, no shock strong enough to move me, just a heavy realization settling in my chest. Everyone had known, and I had been the only one living without that knowledge. After that moment, I started replaying my life with a different awareness. Conversations I had forgotten suddenly made sense. Reactions I once ignored gained weight. I realized this wasn't a secret kept by two people. It was a shared understanding. Relatives knew, family friends knew, people who had watched me grow up knew. They had looked at me with sympathy I never recognized. They had spoken carefully around me, choosing words that avoided the truth. I remembered how often someone would change the subject when I asked innocent questions. At the time, I thought they were protecting me. Now I understood they were protecting themselves. What hurt most was not my father's choice. It was the collective decision to exclude me from reality. Everyone agreed that I was better off not knowing, that my childhood needed to remain intact, even if it was built on omission. I had grown up surrounded by adults who believed silence was kindness, and in doing so, they taught me something far more damaging, that my understanding of my own life was optional, something others could manage for me. I didn't explode. I didn't confront anyone right away. What I felt wasn't loud enough to be called rage. It was colder than that, more precise. Anger requires energy, and I didn't want to give them any more of mine. Instead, I became quiet in a different way. Not the obedient silence I had learned growing up, but an observing one. I started noticing how easily they justified themselves, how often phrases like, "we did what we thought was best," appeared. No one asked what I thought. No one wondered what it was like to realize your entire childhood had been edited for your convenience. I wasn't angry because my father had betrayed my mother. I was angry because everyone had agreed that I didn't deserve the truth, that my role was to remain a child, even after I stopped being one. What hurt the most was understanding that their calm wasn't strength, it was avoidance, and the order I had grown up admiring wasn't stability. It was control, carefully disguised as care. When I finally spoke to my father, it wasn't a confrontation. There was no anger in my voice, no accusations lined up in advance. I didn't need answers anymore. I needed to see him clearly. He listened without interrupting, just as he always had. Calm, composed, almost relieved. He didn't deny anything. He didn't confess either. He spoke in careful sentences, explaining how complicated things were, how adults make choices children wouldn't understand. He said he was trying to protect everyone. I realized then that this was the same language he had always used, the same tone that had kept our home quiet and orderly, the same calm that made questions disappear. For the first time, it didn't work. I wasn't looking at my father as a parent anymore. I was looking at him as a man who had built his life on being reasonable enough to avoid responsibility. His stability wasn't strength, it was distance. And standing there, I understood that nothing he said could give me back what his silence had taken. After that conversation, something settled inside me. Not closure, but clarity. I stopped waiting for explanations that would make things feel fair. I stopped hoping for remorse that would change anything. The truth was already complete. I noticed how naturally my family expected me to move on, to stay quiet, to keep the image intact. They spoke to me gently, as if I were fragile, as if this knowledge should be handled carefully and then put away. I understood then that my silence was still part of the arrangement. For the first time, I chose not to participate. I didn't argue, I didn't accuse. I simply stepped out of the role they had preserved for me, the child who needed protection, the daughter who didn't ask questions. That decision changed everything. Without drama or announcements, I withdrew my emotional presence. I stopped carrying what didn't belong to me, their secrets, their justifications, their version of peace. I realized that growing up didn't mean accepting what adults did. Sometimes it meant refusing to protect their comfort at the expense of your own understanding. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't rewrite the past. I simply stopped carrying a story that was never mine to protect. The truth didn't need to be announced to exist. Once I allowed myself to see it, it changed how I moved through the world. I no longer mistook silence for care or order for love. I understood how easily people confuse comfort with kindness, and how often children are asked to pay for adult choices. My father continued living the way he always had, calm, controlled, unchanged. That was his decision. Mine was different. I chose not to inherit his version of stability. What I took with me wasn't anger. It was scale, the understanding that my life didn't have to fit into the narrow spaces others designed for me. I no longer needed to be protected from reality. I needed to stand inside it. Everyone had known the truth about my father, except me. Now I knew it too. And knowing was enough to leave the lie behind.